How wonderful to see such a brilliant turnout in the beautiful Humanity Lecture Theatre here at the University of Glasgow, especially on a somewhat forbidding night. And welcome to this, this Stevenson Trust event. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here, and also, echoing the late great Nicholas Parsons, our listeners from around the world tuning in via Zoom. My name is Ben Coburn. I'm the Professor of Political Philosophy here at the university, and it's my privilege to chair tonight's proceedings for the Stevenson Trust for Citizenship. The Stevenson Trust was established in 1921 with a gift to the university from Sir Daniel Stevenson to provide for the education of the people of Glasgow on matters of citizenship, local, national, and international. This public lecture series, of which this lecture is part, is one of the ways that the Trust seeks to fulfill that remit. As well as holding these live events, we also make as much material available online as possible. So in connection with that, please note that this event is being filmed and will be made available as a video via the Stevenson archive. We take your presence as consent for that purpose, but bear in mind, for example, if you ask a question, that you will be captured in that way. I should also, while I'm in the business of doing housekeeping, note that we are not expecting a fire drill during this event. So if the fire alarm goes off, please exit back straight through into the cloister the way you came. I wanted to begin by just saying a little bit about Dudley Knowles. This is the Dudley Knowles Memorial Lecture in Political Philosophy, the 10th Dudley Knowles Memorial Lecture in Political Philosophy. Dudley was a political philosopher who taught in the Glasgow department from 1973 to 2011. He published widely on topics that included the philosophy of Hegel, the theory of rights, and the foundations of political obligation. We remember him as a great teacher and as a kind and wise colleague, including as head of department on 2 different occasions. In addition to his work within philosophy, Dudley was a member of the board of the Stevenson Trust for many years, and he was very deeply committed to its mission of putting the insights of academia to work in the public arena. So it seemed fitting, after Dudley died in 2014, for the Trust to commemorate him with an annual public lecture, where we invite an eminent political philosopher to use their craft to tackle a topic of public interest. So with that, I'd like to welcome today's lecturer. Professor Leah Ippey is Ralph Miliband Professor in Politics and Philosophy at the London School of Economics. She was educated at La Sapienza in Rome and at the European University Institute in Florence. She was also a research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. This international education and career history is matched by present international accolades. She is a permanent fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. She is an honorary professor in philosophy at the Australian National University in Canberra. And she is also a fellow of the British Academy and of the Academia Europaea. Professor Ippey's work combines the highest achievement in the academic sphere with wide recognition and power as a public intellectual. Her philosophical expertise spans the history of philosophy, especially the work of Kant and Marx, critical theory, political philosophy, and European literature and history. She is the author and editor of numerous books and articles in all of these areas. Her book, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, was published in 2021. It reflected on her childhood in Albania during the collapse of communism and the transition to capitalism. It is witty, it is moving, and it weaves together history with profound philosophical insight about freedom, memory, and the processes of political change. Very small wonder to me and to anybody else who has read it, I'm sure, that it's been translated into more than 35 languages and honoured with multiple international prizes. It's very exciting that Professor Ippey comes to speak at Glasgow just after publishing another book by Penguin in the same vein. That's Indignity, A Life Reimagined, which brings the same insight and skill to exploring the early 20th century in the Ottoman Empire, in Greece and in Albania through the extraordinary life of her grandmother, Leman. As I hope that brief précis makes clear, Professor Ippi is a thinker who puts her philosophical expertise to work in communicating to a world audience in a way that transcends national and disciplinary boundaries. I am so very delighted that she's here to share and bring this experience and commitment to public philosophy to us in Glasgow today, to deliver this year's Dudley Knowles Memorial Lecture in Political Philosophy on the topic, How Capitalism Undermines Freedom. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. A prominent tradition in philosophy maintains that, unlike other species, humans experience freedom in connection to moral responsibility. On this account, freedom has two dimensions, an external and an internal one. Internal freedom is the freedom required to think what is right. External freedom is the freedom required to do what is right. I'll call the freedom that enables us to do what is right freedom of agency, and I'll use the term agency to distinguish it from choice, which I understand as the capacity to select between different options, whatever they are. And the argument that I want to explore in this year's lecture is that capitalism structurally undermines our freedom of agency, even as it seems to expand our freedom of choice. So, in what follows, I will define capitalism as a social structure that is characterized by private ownership over the most important means of production, the sale of labor in exchange for wages, and the pursuit of profit as a central incentive. And I think it's a wide enough definition that people like Marx, Weber, Schumpeter, Rawls, Hayek all would actually agree on it. So I'm hoping it's not controversial. To understand why capitalism undermines freedom of agency, we need to return to the idea that freedom is what we experience in the moment of moral responsibility when we ask ourselves, what ought I or what ought we to do? And so to be free on this account is not to do whatever strikes your fancy, but to be able to take a critical distance from your passions, your inclinations, your interests, and to ask yourselves if they are reasonable, if they reflect what we might call enlightened thinking, or what Adam Smith, since we're in Glasgow, not the Smith of the Wealth of Nations, but the Smith of the theory of the moral sentiments, calls, I quote, the inhabitant of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct, end of quote. And literature and art are full of examples that explain this intuition. So think about Don Giovanni in the famous Mozart opera, who is presented to us as a character whose passion for seduction turns out to be not liberating, but a case of tyranny of the instincts. Or think another familiar example, Charles Dickens' novella Christmas Carol, which begins by telling us about Scrooge, a character who finds Christmas oppressive and thinks of the accumulation of money as freedom. What is Christmas time to you? Scrooge asks his nephew, Fred. This is a quote. But a time for paying bills without money. A time for finding yourself a year older, but not an hour richer. And of course, we know that by the end of the novella, Scrooge discovers that his passion for money was not freedom, but addiction. And that he actually missed out on more important things like community, solidarity, human connection, and so on. So this capacity to take a critical distance from ourselves and from our immediate preferences is a core aspect of the difference between superficial, apparent freedom and authentic freedom. And again, on this account, there is a difference between apparent and authentic freedom. I am authentically free, not just to the extent that I can choose between different options, that is the freedom of choice that I introduced, but to the extent that my decisions are made in a way that is free from fear, from need, from bias, from manipulation, and so on. So what I try to call freedom of agency. And so to return to Adam Smith, freedom of agency is what enables me to channel the man or the woman within in my decision to pursue my ends in a framework of reflexive distance from my immediate impulses and the choices as they are presented to me at face value. So I think this freedom of agency is exactly what capitalist structures undermine. And to start explaining this point, it's worth thinking about the tensions in the experience of freedom by exploring the different ways in which we talk about it. Or to put it another way, we can start by thinking about the contrast between the notion of freedom of agency that is at the heart of my analysis and the way in which capitalist structures undermine that freedom of agency by conflating it with freedom of choice. So think about one example of instantiation of freedom, freedom of movement. And I pick that because it's so controversial in contemporary political discourse. So when J.D. Vance and Donald Trump call for crackdowns, or Nigel Farage call for crackdowns on immigration, they see the problem of immigration as one of choice, the choice of moving from place A to place B, which is made in the context of an institutional framework based on which the people who cross the border in an unauthorized way act wrongly. Why do they act wrongly? Because they think irregular migrants break the rules, jump the queue, impose themselves unilaterally in another community, and strain the resources of that community. And so, in other words, they make the wrong choice given institutional rules in which other choices are possible. So, what are these other choices? Well, it's the choice to stay in one place, for example, the choice to apply for a visa, or the choice to cross the border in an unauthorized way. These are all options out there available to the agent. Now, on my account of freedom of agency, the problem that is posed by migration is not the choice to go from A to B, but how freedom of movement is related to a capacity that I have to set and to pursue ends in a world in which everyone has that same ability. And so here, and I will go on to unpack this thought, structural constraints play a crucial enabling or disabling role in the exercise of this capacity. And in fact, as I said, if you see the problem of migration as one of choice, Vance and Trump might be right, because at a very superficial level, the migrant who pays a smuggler to cross the Mediterranean does have that freedom of choice. They can do any one of the options that I have outlined. They can pick between A, staying at home, B, paying a smuggler to cross on a dinghy, applying for a visa, C, and waiting to see if they can get one, or something else. And so they don't have just one choice, they have 4 choices on this account. But does that migrant have freedom of agency? So can that migrant set and pursue their ends and channel the person within, I started with, in the world in which they live? So a differently formulated analysis of freedom of movement, understood as an instance of freedom of agency, would say the following proposition. They would say the problem of irregular migration is not that it reflects a wrongful choice, as Trump and Vance would say, but it's also not that exclusion at the border violates an unconditional right to freedom of movement, which is the standard liberal objection or alternative to this account, whereby of the 4 options that I have outlined, the option to cross has to be given priority. The problem has to be raised in a different context, in the context in which we reflect on our freedom of agency. So the decision to move is made in a framework of background rules that may hinder immigrants' freedom of agency. So if I am hungry or sleepy or fearful for the future of my children, there's no context in which I can pursue my ends based on this moral compass of the inhabitant of the breast, of the person, the man within, to do the right thing. And so there's a problem with freedom of agency, even in a context where one can, on the surface, exercise freedom of choice. Now, I started with migration because it's such a salient issue in contemporary liberal democracies, but also because it's a good prism from which we can think about what is wrong with prevailing outlooks on freedom. that fail to pay attention to this difference between agency and choice. And of course, it's now almost trivial to say that we live in a world where humans are so interconnected with each other and integrated that the effects of a system of rules in one place are perceived in another place, such that, for example, when we're thinking about migration, the effects of migration and its discourse around migration in both sending societies and receiving societies are actually not just a question of movement, understood as choice, but a problem of wider social and political relations and of a wider allocation of political responsibility in the context of global injustice. So, and of course, when I say that we're integrated with each other, I don't mean that we're just using the same brands of phones or watching the same news or try to impress each other with photos on the same social media platforms. I mean that we're integrated epistemically, that we share the world in our thoughts. And so the idea that you can just close borders when you're thinking about agency or realize freedom in one place or in one group of states, but not in another, is flawed because it kind of violates this basic insight on freedom that explains it and understands it as a relation of moral responsibility. So this is more or less the view of freedom that informs what I have to say about capitalism. Now, this idea of freedom understood as a relation of responsibility is the foundation of a modern account of political legitimacy and obligation, different from those that were prominent in the ancient world, where the community was the source of moral norms, or in the medieval period, where we invoke the divine right of kings. The idea of legitimation based on freedom and the relational account of freedom explains, for example, why we think of impartial institutions like the state as the kind of authority that we appeal to when there are emergencies like war or pandemic or environmental disasters, and we delegate to that authority the right to suspend certain fundamental freedoms that we all seem to presume are at the heart of our political institutions. And so the very freedoms that the state is supposed to protect, the freedom to move, the freedom to associate with others, the freedom to vote in elections, it's the state as that institution that has a right to also suspend them in circumstances of emergency. And the reason they have that right is we delegate them that freedom. Now, of course, the other aspect of this is that this is the theory of the state, and this is what the state is supposed to do. But actually, many of the states that we have, many of the freedoms that are supported in fundamental legal and constitutional frameworks that make reference to this modern freedom-based account of legitimation are also suspended or restricted as they have been as part of the recent emergencies. But the idea that we're actually all subject to the same constraints when those emergencies are invoked looks increasingly like a rhetorical device designed to ensure that everyone complies. In fact, under capitalism, freedom of agency is bound to suffer because of how wealth interferes in the context in which choices are made. And so think about Elon Musk, for example, who is not a German citizen, but if you remember, in the week of the German elections, he decided to tweet about the AfD supporting the German neo-Nazi party, and it looked like that same tweet was about to change the outcome of the election. Fortunately, he didn't manage that time, but it was interesting that there were concerns that Elon Musk's tweets were going to change the result. And so in that sense, we can see that Musk, who is not a German citizen, with his influence, with his wealth, with his platform, has way more influence in political outcomes than, say, Fritz from Bavaria, who is a German citizen. And also when it comes, for example, to the core functions of the state, critical defense infrastructure and surveillance technology, in July 2025, 75 procurement agreements of the US Army and the $10 billion contract which was one of the largest contracts in US military history, were handed over to Peter Thiel's Palantir Technologies. And Peter Thiel, for those who don't know him, is a man who doesn't think that freedom and democracy are compatible. So I think all these elements, these examples, speak to a more general question concerning the liberal understanding of freedom and the way it suffers under capitalist circumstances because of its relation to choice and agency. Capitalist power structures, and this is what I'm going to unpack in what follows, are difficult to tackle because they are anonymized rather than personal. Occasionally, they take the face of the person, they take the face of Peter Thiel or the face of Elon Musk or the face of Bill Gates, but actually what is really doing the work is the structure. And the kinds of psychological attitudes that capitalism breeds and consolidates are related mostly to selfishness and indifference rather than outright aggression. But that doesn't mean that freedom under capitalism is any less concerning than freedom under these other regimes that I have described, under the monarchy or under divine rights of kings, or when we thought that community was uncritically assumed to be the source of legal norms. If anything, it's harder because they are more pernicious. And so when power is connected to money and is spontaneous and anonymized, it ends up being more difficult to fight. And so in some ways, my thoughts here are the opposite of Hayek, a spontaneous order like the capitalist market at its best, rather than enabling freedom, as Hayek thought, ends up undermining it. So let me now unpack why does capitalism do this. And let me start with the real story. I was recently at an Albanian dinner party and I was talking to one of our very high-ranking politicians, government minister, and I said, I don't understand why we have these ridiculously low taxes in Albania when we don't have proper unions and we can't defend workers' rights. The whole country is, as many other East European countries, Balkan countries, is dominated by oligarchs. And working people then end up leaving the country because they don't earn enough. And so then they go to the UK on dinghies, and then the Tories in the UK complain that it's full of Albanian migrants here crossing the channel illegally on small boats and so on. And he said, well, you know, these are all great points, but if we tax too much, businesses will go to Serbia. And if we don't have enough investments, the state can't even pay for healthcare, for building roads, for infrastructural maintenance, for whatever minimal social services the state is supposed to provide. And then it can't service its debts in the international markets in a way that can keep its credibility going with financial indexes, market rating agencies, and so on. And so he had one of the country's top oligarchs sitting next to him. And he said, so don't ask me all these questions about why we can't tax. I'm not the boss. Ask him. He's the real boss. And so I turned to him and I said, well, there you go. Why don't you pay your workers properly? So why don't you let your state tax you instead of threatening to go to Serbia? And he said, well, I'd love to, but it's such a tough environment out there. Productivity is declining. COVID was a mess. We have this geopolitical instability all the time. And if I do what you say, I won't make any profits. And if I don't make enough profit, I won't be able to innovate. And if I don't innovate, I can't keep up with the pace of change and I will go bust. And someone else will exploit the workers anyway. The only good thing that will have come out of all this is that I will have become a worker. And what do you get out of this? And so he was trying to then explain how his company was competing in the global market with German companies, and that if he started paying the workers properly instead of helping them, he would become one of them, and so on. And so he said, ask the Germans. And when I went to Germany to give this lecture, I did ask some German oligarchs, and they said, ask the United States. And of course, the United States will say, ask China or someone else. So basically, I think what this story, and it is a real story, is not that I didn't just make it up, illustrates is that capitalist unfreedom has to be understood as a type of structural unfreedom. And focus on social structures is useful in explaining actions that aren't reducible to what such and such individual does and thinks, and also not really to the just intersubjective reciprocal interactions between individuals. So it's not just about the minister, it's not just about the oligarch. It's about what larger patterns inform their behavior and larger patterns that transcend these reciprocal interactions and how we can take them into account. So when they say, when the politician that I mentioned and when the oligarch that I mentioned say that they would love to help the workers, but they can't, what they're doing is they're drawing attention to the limitations of both individual and intersubjective frameworks for their behavior. and they are referring to a broader set of circumstances within which their wrongful behavior ought to be analyzed. So the idea is that structural norms establish the background patterns against which the behavior of typical people like them make decisions concerning typical conflicts like the ones that they find themselves in their workplace all the time. But the problem is not with a businessman as such or with a politician as such, because it's not really about what they feel and what they think and what I can persuade them to do. It's rather about what someone in their social role and their social position should feel and should think. And so their judgments and their decisions are informed by this implicit reliance on this system of rules and scrutiny, which is a kind of invisible authority that informs and rewards their conduct. So to explain what this invisible authority is and what this type of constraint is, I use the term structural domination. And domination is often understood as a morally problematic constraint on freedom and a type of interference with freedom of agency. It's also understood as a constraint on freedom that is robust across counterfactuals. And so the idea is that domination captures a type of constraint on freedom that seems to respect specific instances of choice, but violates agency. So the oligarch, for example, can choose whether to sack or not the worker, but he doesn't make that decision under conditions of freedom of agency, but out of fear of losing his position of advantage in a competitive market. So under a condition of what we might call structural domination. And actually, as he does in my example, as he did in reality, in emphasizing the limits of his action, he draws attention to the constraints on his freedom, to the system's interference with his ability to make decisions that are robust across these counterfactuals, out of fear, out of worry about productivity, out of concern for whether he will innovate or not. And so basically the system has an impact in and affects the way in which he makes decisions and affects his freedom to follow another set of imperatives, a different way of thinking about social reality that is not informed by the rules of the free capitalist market, but those of the man within. So social structures exercise power in such a way that the mere threat of sanctions for not compliance affects agents' self-perception, to the point of then making them adapt personal preferences in the direction that is required to comply with them. But the issue of who would apply the sanctions or enable them to exist is irrelevant to this moral question. So the problem here is the divorce between what one feels and does and what one ought to feel and ought to do, which creates a void which seems to unsettle the agents and their commitment, and actually seems to shake their perception of being members of a social order that they believe they ought to embrace. And so it's this divorce between the choice of the specific choices that they make and the background conditions under which those choices are made that affects the way those decisions go. So basically this gap between what one does and feels and what one ought to do and ought to feel is what I call alienation. And so the symptom of structural domination is agential alienation. So the alienation is the result of a divorce between freedom of choice and freedom of agency. And it's characteristic, as I want to explain, of a condition in which there is a kind of scrutiny of the meaningfulness of the social position one occupies, without there necessarily being the freedom to make different rules or to pave an alternative course of action. And as I try to explain, it's symptomatic of a certain restriction of freedom where the mere being sanctioned for non-compliance is sufficient to paralyze one's disposition to resist and to change the norms. So there's a famous passage in the Holy Family where Marx emphasizes how, this is a quote, "The propertied class and the class of the proletariat present the same human self-alienation." So what this quote is saying, under capitalist conditions, both the capitalist and the worker's freedom of agency is undermined. So this is a very puzzling paragraph because we're used to thinking about the Marxist critique of capitalism as a critique that focuses on the proletariat and singles out the capitalists as perpetrating an injustice. But here it seems that both of them are struggling. And the reason they are both presenting instances of unfreedom of agency is that where we think of domination as taking an impersonal form, both the capitalist and the worker are unable to see themselves as autonomous agents that can freely determine the social order that they are part of. And Marx then explains this insight a little bit more, although not too much, which is why I'm trying to sort of unpack this here, by talking about two French proverbs, which he says give us an insight into what kind of domination is at stake. So there's one French proverb that says "Nulle terre sans seigneur," so no land without lord. And then the other French proverb that says "L'argent n'a pas de maître," money has no master. So in the first case, he says, this we see the personal nature of domination under feudalism, where you have landowners and a personal mastery, personal rule that informs the social conditions under which agents make choices. And in the second case, money has no master, which is the case that characterizes capitalist social relations. You have both capitalists and workers dominated by capital. And so, as he says, in bourgeois society, no one is firmly connected with the particular property that they own. And so this medieval proverb, "No land without landowner," is replaced by this new one, "Money has no master." So when structural domination is pervasive, alienation affects both capitalists, who we usually think as dominators, and the workers, whom we usually think as the dominated part, though not in equal measure. And so seeing how both are alienated helps us capture the moral wrong of capitalism understood as a type of structural domination. A wrong that can be detected even if we abstract from the contribution of specific and complicity of specific agents responsible for doing specific things within that system. Because what matters here is that capital, understood as a social structure, dominates rather than the specific capitalists. So the domination of the workers by the capitalists is a secondary derivation of a primary wrong, which is the domination by capital of both. So it would be wrong to think of the capitalist as an individual who formed the intention of dominating the worker and of controlling them. On the contrary, the idea here is that the imperatives of capital frame the choices of capitalists, who in turn are compelled to dominate the workers in a derivative way that is divorced from what they would really like to do, or what they would like to do under other counterfactuals. Now, the interesting thing here is that when capital dominates structurally, both capitalists and workers are alienated. In other words, both their freedom of agency is impaired. And here, structural domination can take legal forms. So when, for example, workers are prevented by juridical rules to negotiate working hours with capitalists, or when capitalists are bound by international regulations that favor concentrations of big capital over small ones. And the idea is that here there is a sort of political channel through which social domination, through which structural domination is perpetrated. But domination can also be driven socially by norms and by socially mandated patterns of behavior and competitive dynamics that go beyond legal control. The logic of the circumstances is such that it forces certain actors in those circumstances to act in accordance with what they anticipate is the reasonable thing to do under these constraints, and so to form preferences and to adapt them and to act accordingly. So structural domination through legal rules coerces people into compliance. Social domination through norms, through social norms, raises the cost of non-compliance. And so this pathology of freedom that alienation reveals to us consists of, in the divorce between freedom of agency as the kind of freedom that ought to characterize human beings insofar as they think of themselves as autonomous producers of their life, and the reality of that agency burdened by structural constraints. And so again, the question of who enables the exercise of structural power and who carries it out is irrelevant to understanding how alienation reveals itself in these instances of structural domination. Because if there was anyone to blame, either through contribution or through omission, you wouldn't feel alienated, you'd feel enraged, you'd know what to do about it. So alienation is exactly symptomatic of this case where you feel stuck, you feel like it's not quite the right thing to do, but you feel like you're also forced to do that. And so capitalist structures, in my view, exercise power by being ordered or structured compatibly with certain views of what the point and purpose of social institutions is, from which then depends agents' judgments and interpretation and perception of their social offices and position within that structure. And so the more pervasive the structure, the more dominant the upheld interpretation, the less space there is for agents to question and to contest those prevailing legal and social norms. So the problem of unfreedom under capitalism is the failure for both the capitalist and the worker to recognize their free agency as reflected in their work. So both the capitalist and the worker are alienated because they feel the unease of occupying the social role that they occupy without having a sufficient capacity to step out of that social role and to do something differently and to take on a different one. And so an alienated agent is someone who succumbs to the pressure of social demands in such a way that he feels he ought to uphold this role and doesn't have enough possibility for taking on a different role or for doing something different. So structural domination tends to emerge as a result of these unintended consequences of the actions of independent agents, in which the moral failure at stake is one of contribution or omission, and this leads into a failure, into a reduction of freedom of agency. So to really account for structural domination as a kind of domination that is distinctive from domination between agents, we have to be able to explain both how the structural curtailment of people's freedom, regardless of the beliefs and intentions and pro-attitudes that the agents who operate within these structures form, how this kind of failure is a distinctive type of failure compared to the failure that is given rise to by the uncontrolled exercise of the will of powerful agents. It's a different kind of unfreedom that we're talking about. And the difference is that structural relations are anonymous, but that they affect the dominated dominator's reflection and self-perception as they affect the dominated ones. But what's interesting, what I want to highlight here is the fact that they also do the same on the dominators, not just on the dominated. And that alienation enables us to analyze how exactly that happens, because it helps us to understand how structural domination isn't just a distinctive type of hindrance. So it's not just a kind of vitiation or influence or constraint on agents, but as a distinctive kind of wrong. And it's a wrong independent from and irreducible to the other agential types of wrongs that I have also highlighted. So all of this might seem a little bit puzzling because it's kind of simple enough to understand how workers lose their freedom. But then what about the capitalists? Some people would say, surely the capitalist benefits from the domination of workers by capital. And surely if there were no capitalists, there would be no capital as such to restrict anyone's freedom. So how can structural domination be primary in this way? And I think to answer this objection, you have to notice the shift from the contribution and the discussion of the properties of capitalist agents to the contribution of capitalists as a class. So true, if there was no capitalist class, we would not be able to understand structural domination and what domination by capital means. But the point I'm making is that a social structure determines the roles and positions of agents involved in that structure, such that the classes that are necessary to uphold that structure are part of the definition of what kind of structure we're talking about. And so if we emphasize the structure wouldn't be there if there were no agents with the intention of upholding that structure, basically we're just insisting on a kind of tautology where to the contribution to the moral analysis. It's true. Talk about capital would be meaningless if there was no capitalist class, but it would also be meaningless if there were no factories, no banks, no credit cards. And so the capitalist class, just like the factories and the banks and the credit cards, are all essential components to understanding capitalism as a structure. And the fact that specific capitalists perform the social roles that allow the capitalist class to reproduce itself is actually a descriptive part of what it is to be that social structure, just like the banks and the financial credit agencies and so on. So Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Peter Thiel, as individuals are no more relevant to our analysis than the fact that there is an HSBC bank or that there is another credit rating agency. Because if there were no Elon Musks and no HSBCs, there would be another capitalist and another bank that would perform exactly the same role. And so we're now talking about classes of and properties of classes. So long as the social rules that organize productive activity in a way that complies with the imperatives of capital, like the division of labor under capitalist societies, or the asymmetry between who owns and who sells their labor for a living, the wrong of structural domination is irreducible to this agential domination. Now, I have about 4 more minutes.
Go ahead.
Otherwise, I skip the critique and then we'll...
No, keep it.
We're doing okay? Okay. So think about one other critique to this account, which is that the capitalist is a moral agent, and a moral agent is, or one hopes it is, different from a building. So being a moral agent who can make moral decisions, the capitalist could, the argument says, if he wanted, or if she wanted, withdraw their support to the structure. And if all the capitalists did this, the structure would no longer be there. But this is true, but it's also kind of trivial, because just highlighting that there would be no capital without capitalists doesn't add anything to the moral analysis of structural domination as a primary wrong. So if the idea is that the structure is replicated through the social classes that are required to apply the system of rules that the structure entrenches and upholds, replication doesn't need to take, as I said, the form of coercion or of legal undermining of alternatives, but can also take the form of cooptation. It's trivial to say that structural rules require individual agents to be upheld. But it's important to make this distinction between classes and individuals when it comes to trying to understand how structures constrain freedom of agency. And what I've tried to explain is that structures constrain it by creating the social roles. The social classes are part of the social roles that reproduce and replicate structural rules. And so if we understand domination as a morally problematic nature in the allocation of social roles, it's the idea is that it is a morally problematic because it generates those social roles as part of the social classes that contribute to the maintenance of this system of rules. So now, one final criticism to this account is that if we focus on domination by structures, we're blurring the lines of responsibility. So it looks like we're kind of letting the capitalist off the hook by saying, look at these poor capitalists, they're just as dominated, they're also suffering from unfreedom, their freedom of agency is also impaired. And we then just end up blaming the system and lose sight of who is responsible within this system. But what I have said is not that there are important differences in how capitalists and workers are dominated by capital. So I grant that there is a difference in the pattern, and there is a difference in the way in which the structure affects the workers and the capitalists. The reason for insisting on the structural approach is that you can generate from it a different kind of social critique and a different kind of political analysis. One that shifts the focus from the individual interventions of particular agents, from things like ethical consumerism or boycotting specific companies or taking this more interactional approach to political change, to one that requires a fundamental transformation with a sight to what are the types of classes that are doing the work in reproducing a particular injustice. So I think rather than absolving domination and dominators, my analysis facilitates this different kind of critique, which emphasizes the contribution of social classes rather than individuals, and that redirects the target of critique along class lines. And I think this is something that political theory has lost in its over-reliance on the specifying domination as agential domination, but which is, of course, the central insight of structuralist, traditional, more orthodox approaches to social, Marxist social analysis, which try to focus on the loss of agents' freedom through intervention, through impairment by a social structure. So alienation, understood as the moral unease that is provoked by the divorce between the standpoint of the moral agent on the one hand and the occupier of the social position on the other, I think is intelligible only once we understand the wrong of structural constraints on freedom as distinctive kinds of moral wrongs, and if we understand how capitalism undermines that kind of freedom of agency. And hopefully, this is really my last sentence, rather than paralyzing social struggle, the upshot of this analysis is that this alternative focus on domination by structures actually helps us think differently about collective and political agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's a common practice at the Knowles lectures for us to have a respondent to the lecture who will comment on some of the, in this case, many themes raised. So our respondent today is Dr. Nicolas Cote of the University of Glasgow. Dr. Cote has been a lecturer in moral and political philosophy here since 2023. His work spans various topics, including the foundations of ethics, applied ethics, political theory. One of the things that unites his contribution in these various different areas is a conviction that philosophical conundra are often rather more susceptible of formal treatment, for example, through the application of decision theory, than is appreciated by many of his peers. He has applied this conviction in some surprising places, like the study of domination and choices between moral theories, and always to very illuminating effect. So we're very grateful indeed to Dr. Cote for being the Stevenson Trust's respondent for Professor Ippy's lecture. Please join me in welcoming him.
Can you hear me all right in the back? Good. I reassure you there is no math tonight. So, one of the most enduring critiques of capitalism to emerge from the writings of Marx is probably the critique that, although it seems to respect the freedom of individuals to live as they please, capitalism ultimately entraps us psychologically by somehow eroding our motivations and imposing on us an alien set of desires and imperatives. This is a condition that Marx calls alienation. And in her talk tonight, Leah has offered what I think is a very imaginative and compelling reinterpretation of this critique in terms of a tension between freedom of choice and freedom of agency. Capitalism, she has argued, makes us free to do more things than other comparable systems of production, but ultimately, in the process, makes it harder for us to live in the ways that we feel that we ought to. And the key problem, I think, is that there's something about the deep structure of capitalism, something about the nature of competition, the way that the profit motive orients the choices of firms, and the way that the distribution of capital divides labor, that just doesn't reward people for acting on the most deeply held, most sincerely held values. Instead, it rewards them for acting on more extrinsic sets of values, ones which, I take it Leah suggested, are the ones which serve the interest of capital. So I think there's no doubt that this tension that Leah has identified is real. I mean, one sees it all over the place. When I was listening to her presentation, I was vividly reminded of when I was living in Toronto. There used to be a cafe called The Anarchist, which inspiringly advertised itself, this was on its business cards, as an, quote, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial cafe, shop, and radical community space on stolen land. It was a cooperative where all the workers got paid the same as the founder. The business model was that customers paid what they could afford for coffee, but then the pastries and the anarchist merch were charged at full price to make up the difference. It will not surprise you to learn that it went bust after barely a year in business. Yeah. Capitalism, it seems, does not reward fanciful anarchist design principles in coffee shops. Another illustration, perhaps more sinister illustration of this tension, comes to us from the writings of Benjamin Constant. So writing shortly after the fall of Napoleon, Constant argued that there's something about the extraordinary expansion of freedom of choice brought about by the success of early capitalist society, which had turned the hard business of democracy into a kind of chore. Commercial society is so successful in giving us new ways of using our free time that now the hard business of governing ourselves takes us away from all these occupations and has become a chore. And he feared that this is what tempts us into accepting the Napoleonic bargain. Let me take away this chore of governing off your hands, and I will protect your commercial interests and your freedom of choice. And, you know, looking at Peter Thiel and the Silicon Valley billionaires who got in bed with Donald Trump, one can see that he had a point. So, I mean, I think there's no doubt that the tension Leah has identified is real and that it is pretty relatively widespread in capitalism. That being said, in the spirit of inviting the audience to raise probing questions, I guess it's not clear to me what to make of this tension yet. And so I want to make two observations. The first is, it's not really clear to me from the argument that Leah has laid out just how deep the tension she has identified ultimately runs. You know, it's quite proper that we should notice the many ways in which capitalism impinges on our freedom of agency. But I think, you know, in fairness, one should also notice some of the ways in which it actually enhances that freedom. So, you know, one thing that capitalism really makes it quite easy for people to do is to benefit one another and improve each other's lives. You know, one of the best, easiest ways to improve someone's life is to provide them with something that they really need. You know, food, clothing, shelter, entertainment, new vaccines, dental anesthesia. Dental anesthesia is really, really good. That's really good. And capitalism makes it relatively easy to benefit each other in this way because it makes it possible for us to earn a living by doing it. In societies where the incentives just aren't in place to bring innovation products to market, it's just harder for people to be beneficent in this way towards one another. Not because, you know, we all, us as the good people, wouldn't be motivated to help each other, but just because you wouldn't have the social infrastructure needed to support your endeavors. And relatedly, you know, it's certainly true that capitalism rewards certain social vices like greed and selfishness. But I think it's also true that in other ways it does reward certain social virtues like trust, honesty, and respect. So the economist Kenneth Arrow observed that, just quoted here, virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust. Certainly any transaction conducted over a period of time. Point, you know, you also find this point in Smith, is there are billions of transactions happening all the time involving millions of people who do not know each other from Adam or Eve. A lot has to be taken on trust for any of this to work. And what this means is that societies where people are prepared to trust one another and where people are prepared to be honest with one another in their business dealings are going to be more successful under capitalism than societies in which people are not willing to trust one another or where people are very duplicitous. So in that respect, capitalism does reward certain virtues. And that brings me to the second question that I want to raise about the presentation. That is that it's not entirely clear to me to what extent the problems she has identified with capitalism are really particular to capitalism and trace back to the specific features she identified, as opposed to being quite general features of free societies. So the founder of The Anarchist claims that the reason his cafe failed was because of, quote, ethically bankrupt sources of capital and his, quote, lack of generational wealth. But that's not why he failed. He failed because customers didn't want to pay for overpriced pastries or free coffee. In other words, if I can put this slightly tendentiously, he was unable to live in the way that he thought he ought to be able to live, or that he ought to live, because other free agents, acting out of their own free will, chose to act in ways that frustrated his desires by responding strategically to his really, really bad pricing strategy. But of course, that's a problem that's going to occur for just about everyone in any situation in which the thing that it is best for you to do by your own lights, by the lights of your own values, is going to depend sensitively on what others choose to do. So various churches over the past decades have relaxed their opposition to same-sex marriage, mostly due to pressure from within by younger congregants. So faced with a choice between, on the one hand, continuing to enforce their most deeply held orthodox religious values and enforcing those values against their members, or retaining the loyalty of their younger congregants by essentially compromising their ways of living and liberalizing. Many churches, like the United Mennonite Church of Canada, chose to liberalize. So in both the church case and in the case of the anarchist, what impinges on our freedom of agency, it seems to me, is not really anything in particular to do with who owns what or what motives drives them. Rather, it's the freedom of other people's agency. And so in the end, while I have no doubt that there is a deep tension in capitalism between freedom of choice and freedom of agency, for all the reasons Leah has given, I guess it's just not clear to me how profound a condemnation of capitalism this ultimately implies. And that's it for me.
Okay, super. Thank you very much, Nicola. We have a little time for questions, my friends. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and I will ask Sam to come over to you with a microphone. That's partly for people in the room, partly for people online. So, hands up. I'll start with Michael. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great job to both of you. I'd like to come at the last point that Nicholas was making from a slightly different angle, focusing on this idea of structural domination. Because this is something of a Hayekian point, but it's also a classical Republican one. Domination requires a dominance, a master. If you have no masters, money has no master, you are dominated. And there's something particular about human beings interfering at arbitrarily the lives of other human beings that is offensive to people, to a long political theoretical tradition. So the idea of structural domination isn't necessarily under that tradition a contradiction in terms if identifiable human beings, whether individually or collectively, have designed and imposed that structure. But the Hayekian point is that when an order is genuinely spontaneous, we may dislike it in all sorts of ways. We may rail against it. But it makes no sense to say we're dominated by a spontaneous social order any more than it makes sense to say we're dominated by the physical limitations of our evolved human bodies and our mortality, which is the result of a different spontaneous order, or the weather, which certainly in Glasgow we rail against it, but we aren't dominated by it because it doesn't have agents. So since Nicholas's point that the features of the limitations on my ability to live as I believe I ought to will emerge in any kind of human society. The only question from Hayek's point of view is, will those limitations be dominating because those structures are designed by other human beings to dominate us? Or will those limitations be like the limitations posed on my agency by my mortality or by the dampness of the climate, be things that, although unfortunate in various ways, aren't dominating because they aren't being imposed upon us by dominance?
Do you want to tackle that now?
Yeah, well, let me reassure you, I think we can overcome capitalism. It's not like the weather in Glasgow. Maybe can I respond to some of these?
Of course you can.
To some of those sort of comments, and then
yeah.
we've some of the answers back. Because I would like to comment on this question of how deep is this tension of this relationship between capitalism and freedom, and I think it is very deep. Just take the example of innovation, or take the example of reaping the benefits of one's labor. One of the points that I'm making in the lecture is that, of course, from one part of the world, for one category of people, it's very natural to think that capitalism gives us innovation, gives us vaccine, gives us dental teeth, and so on. But just look at all the people who don't have that, who think about, I was in Albania during COVID, and we were really struggling for vaccines. There were all these companies who had the vaccines, they had patented them, and all the rich governments were getting them in no time and distributing them to their citizens in no time. And in the meantime, all the poor countries, because of the copyright, because of the patent rules and because of property rules and international arrangements, just didn't have access to those innovations. So it seems to me that it's not an axiom that just because a system innovates, it innovates for everyone. And one of the points that I'm making is that actually one of the problems of capitalism and the reason it sort of reflects this fundamental lack of respect for freedom of agency is that it just innovates for some people, for some parts of the world, and not for others. And that is, to me, a structural feature of capitalism. It does come with a description, with a package, that if you live in a capitalist world, those asymmetries of wealth and power, both within a state in terms of who owns the means of production and who sells their labor for a living, but also between states in the global order, are characteristic of the structure, are a description of what it means. I'm not so convinced that trust is a virtue of commercial interactions. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had contracts. I think one of the reasons we have the modern state and we have contracts is exactly to reassure people that it's okay, you don't have to trust someone. You can sign a contract and you have a third party that guarantees that there is this contract. And in fact, again, reflecting on my experience in Albania, during socialism, we used to get a lot of things on trust, and we would tell the shopkeeper, don't worry, I'll bring the money later. And they're like, yeah, sure, don't worry about it. And then actually the minute the country became capitalist, that was all gone and nobody was trusting anyone anymore. And you really had to pay right there, right now. So I'm not so convinced that it's that commercial society actually encourages honesty and trustworthiness and respect. I think it often undermines them, and perhaps even compared to alternative systems, that's exactly where it fails. I guess I would say, going back to the example of the anarchist, that although I respect the owner who had his diagnosis of what was going on with his cafe and what was the problem with the system where he had this, seems to have had this ability needs principle, you know, the famous Marxist thing, to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities. And so there you seem to have in the anarchist this motto in the practice of the cafe. The reason it fails is for the same reason that the oligarch doesn't want to pay his workers more, because he's in a system where that is just not how things are run. The ability needs principle is not the way in which you run a cafe. And if you try to depart, much as you might want to do it, and much as you might have for a time customers that are willing to abide by that ability needs principle, the overarching incentive system is such that the anarchist cafe will fail. And that is, I think, makes the point that I was trying to make in the talk. Okay, final point about, and this now on the question of freedom and on this relationship with domination. I think, I don't know if you'd be more comfortable if we called it oppression rather than domination. So I don't know how much of it is terminological. And so sometimes it's hard to think of domination without a dominus, without a master, but you can think of broader structure of oppression. And I'm not so fixated with the term. I'm happy to call it oppression by capitalism rather than domination by capitalism. But I think, want to emphasize the fact that it's wrong to think of capitalism like the weather. In fact, we should do the other thing. We should think of the weather more like capitalism. Because this distinction between nature and freedom that shapes a lot of these arguments is one where we don't understand that both nature and the social world are interacting. So this is now going back to Hegel and to Dudley Knowles, and this idea of the dialectics of nature and freedom is such that weather phenomena now are shaped by human beings, and human effects, human societies are constructions of will. There is human will there, and just as there is will to create them. Now, those people are not living. They're not agents that are there here and now, the people who created. They're not people that we can pinpoint to individually in explaining what this structure is, but it is a man-made structure. And it's the fact that it is a man-made structure helps us understand what is the advantage of having a structural approach to the phenomenon as opposed to one that is purely reducing it to interactions between agents. And so if we think about, you know, what some in the Marxist tradition call this dead labor and living labor, this idea that living labor relies on the dead labor of previous generations and so on. There is will there, there is freedom there, and it's that historically entrenched unfreedom that produces the kinds of societies that we live now under, and the incentive structures and the incentive systems that we have inherited. But that, again, goes to the point that I'm trying to make, which is that if we understand it as a structural type of unfreedom, then we also have different ways of thinking about agency and about future change.
Lovely, thank you very much. Let's take one from Karen right up at the back, please.
This is really interesting, really important, I think. ask about is whether the logic that you were talking about the sacrifice of reflected agency, if you will, to capitalism can be extrapolated beyond the sort of commercial sectors into the public sector. I'm thinking about, in particular, a moment, and I'm aware that there are many people who are going to correct me on this, and that's the immediate aftermath of the 2010 general election in the UK, when there was a lot of question about what would be the shape and who would be governing the UK. Would it be Labour and the Lib Dems? Would it be Conservatives? And once all of this was going on, the overwhelming question was not what do the people want, but this is a moment of democratic choice. That was not the fundamental thing that people were falling back on. What I remember was the strong imperative that was put forward that the markets needed to have an immediate resolution of a coalition in place in order to give it confidence. The other thing that I kept thinking about as you were talking about the situation was, dare I say it, universities. That in universities, the logic of the capitalist imperative seems to have become incredibly important. In fact, I remember lots of people who said, well, the university really isn't an educational institution, it's a business. And actually that's not true. Actually, legally they're charities, which invokes a whole other set of images. But I'm just wondering if the constraints on people's actions and agency is something that capitalism influences far beyond perhaps some of its immediate arenas of activity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Absolutely. So I think there's a part I spoke about alienation in the paper, and there's this is part of a book project where there's another chapter which is about commodification. And this idea that, public institutions can also be commodified when they fall prey to these capturing dynamics by capital. I completely agree with you. And what I would say, though, is that it's also important not to be too reductionist on that, because there's a risk that we go too far then on the structuralist side, when we think that, universities, politics is captured by markets, and then you really don't see where agency is. I would say that that's where it's important to have a more nuanced analysis of the relationship between capital and the state, which is, again, something that we've sort of lost in political theory. We don't really talk about the relation between capitalism and the state anymore. And there used to be all these great discussions in the 70s that we have somehow just thrown out of the window for no particularly good reason. But I think it's one of the insights that comes from those conversations is that that's how far public institutions are commodified or respond or fail to respond to imperatives of capital depends on the politics of those institutions. And so when it's no coincidence that we are now at the end of sort of neoliberal period where health institutions, universities have all been captured because it was part of the imperative of neoliberalism to make the public more like the private. And so then all the pathologies of the private are also revealed in the public, and all of us now see what the effects of that are in universities when we respond to these incentives. But it's also important to know that there is another way of thinking about public institutions that tries to rescue some of that from capture by capitalist markets and by capitalist logic and profit-seeking imperative, and that when that is the case, the public doesn't exactly respond like the private. So there you have, I think, a bit more nuance between, a neoliberal system, a social democratic system, a populist way of thinking about the relationship between the state and the market, all produce different results. So, but I completely agree with you. And actually, one of the things you were talking about the 2010 generally, but one of the things that I was very upset by was when Liz Truss, the main criticism against Liz Truss was that the markets don't like her. And I kept thinking, well, this is nobody on the left should ever say this, because this becomes then a way of reinforcing the logic whereby we ask ourselves, what does the market want? And you shouldn't ask yourself, what does the market want? You should ask yourself, what do people want?
Wonderful. Sam, could you come over to this lady here, please? Sorry, I thought there was a walkway up the back that you could scurry across. Lovely.
Thanks very much. I just now realized that what you last said is that you're the Ralph Miliband professor, not the Ralph Darrenbach professor, which is very reassuring for someone from Eastern Europe. But I as Bulgarian, I can't. But as we come back to 2 points, maybe that the regional kind of knowledge and history could help open. And I'm in agreement with everything you said, but I want to tease a few points, also as a sociologist. And one is that as a Marxist, I'm very happy to see workers versus capitalists kind of confrontation. And as a sociologist of class and labor, I'm seeing everything, but in reality, and I'm feeling a lot of categories are skipped in an explanation like this. First, starting with the Seleni and company, or the Oral and companies, capitalism without capitalists. So the managers, the state apparatchiks, and everybody that manages capital without having the possession thereof. Or if you go further down the food chain, if you think of high standings, precariat and so forth. So there are different categories of workers who, in this explanation, might, I can still see how your explanation fits into this, but I need more steps to be made in your logical chain. And also with that would allow us to think of levels of resistances. And just use the example of the migrants. How about second generation migrants? So constraint is removed, safety is more complete, capital is not necessarily owned, but they are the ones that kick the ladder. So it would be kind of interesting to follow this logic and think how capitalism coerces them out of what and why solidarity there not possible. And then the other.
I think because we have a little bit of a queue, so I might ask Professor Ippy to respond to what you've just said, and then I'll come back to you later in the question session if we have time, if that's okay. Thank you.
I'm happy to have just the last one. No, whatever. Okay. I think you're completely right on both questions. So the first one, the reason I didn't go into the sociology of class was that I was more interested in explaining this question of freedom and making this distinction between freedom of choice and freedom of agency, and trying to understand from a more moral philosophy, political philosophy perspective, the patterns of domination. But I completely agree that when you go into the very last bit of my talk, which is the one that I only sketched very briefly when I said we need to think about classes and then we need to think about responsibility allocated along class lines, then I think the sociology of class is really important. And I completely agree with you that there are these differences between managers, and just as there are between bankers, and there's a difference between financial capital and industrial capital. So there's a lot of rich literature there, which exactly the debate between Ralph Miliband and Poulantzas has a lot to say on all of those aspects. But I didn't go there just because I was focusing more on domination and freedom. And with the second generation migrant, I think that's, and this question of solidarity that you raise is really important. And I think in a way is the result of the fact that we think of solidarity just along citizenship lines now. And so we have lost, and this is part when I say we, I mean those who want to be critical of capitalism from a progressive perspective somehow have lost the categories from within which to recover the progressive way of talking about solidarity. And so we don't really have class solidarity. Nobody talks about class solidarity anymore. And so then the question of solidarity is reduced to national solidarity, civic solidarity, patriotism, and all those alternative parallel discourses make it then really hard to see that, second generation migrant or has more to share with someone who is in a different country but in the same social position, in the same social role, than with someone who is very rich from their own state, because they've just internalized this logic of integration and belonging and everything that follows from that.
Super, thank you. As I said, we will come back to you if there's time later on. But gentleman in the next row, David, if you would, thank you.
Thank you so much for this. The question is going to pick up, I think, on Nico's last comment. I'm not a political philosopher, but I'm a philosopher, so I have this unusual compulsion to be devil's advocate. So I was, like Nico, I was kind of thinking of the situations you're giving, especially in your anecdote, those cases where individuals are, what they should rationally do are the things that individually rational to do are not things that definitely don't amount to an optimal outcome. And that obviously is a thing that does happen in capitalism. But the kind of the talk sort of suggests a kind of causal relation, like it's not just that these things happen in capitalism. Capitalism especially promotes these things. And I guess maybe this I didn't understand the answer earlier, but I didn't quite see yet why that was the case. So let me try and suggest an alternative. You might think actually scarcity generates these situations. It's the fact that we live in a world with scarce resources that makes it inevitable that there are going to be situations where individuals are rationalized in doing things that are suboptimal. Not necessarily choices, but I'm throwing it as an alternative. And if that were right, I mean, I could even leave open that actually capitalism, well, very far from the ideal, actually improves freedom because, maybe the immense resources are scarce, or maybe they're less scarce than they would be under alternatives. The main takeaway I want to say is I didn't quite see yet why the kind of the thing I think is that the stronger claim that like capitalism actually promotes these situations and not just that they occur. What's
So I think my definition of capitalism was that it's a system of social allocation of resources that is premised on this asymmetry in ownership that is kind of structural to it, that's fundamental to it, and then the pursuit of profit as a central incentive. And I think the combination of those two means that when you think about freedom in terms of relations of responsibility, there is this asymmetry on how capitalism delivers, because it delivers for the people that it's kind of are at the core of its concerns, and it doesn't deliver for the others. It's part of what capitalism is. But I didn't say, and I don't think it wasn't my talk, I didn't defend the idea that an alternative system doesn't undermine freedom of agency. All I was saying was that capitalism undermines freedom of agency. And that's all my claim. I haven't made the other claim, which is that there is another feasible alternative which would not undermine freedom of agency. So I kind of happen to think that as well, but I haven't actually argued it here. All I've argued here is that capitalism undermines freedom of agency. And I think, so the point of the fact that there could be another society where there is also scarcity, and so that's all acceptable and plausible, because I didn't say anything to rule that out. But I think I did say enough to suggest that capitalism as a structure works with certain incentives, with a certain allocation of social rules, with an asymmetry between social classes that makes it the case that rationally, the person that rationally wants to do the right thing can't because of the social position that they're in.
Super. Anything online, Robert? No? Okay, questions, hands up. Could you come to this lady here and then John Curtis up in the back after that, please?
Hi. I'm actually a layperson, so I didn't understand half the stuff you're talking about. The only thing I didn't get is the Marx and capitalism and socialism. And I thought about an example of socialism, which was in Israel, with the Capitalism, which really worked very hard to have a socialistic society when people really shared and decided to be all equal, everybody done whatever they could. And it doesn't work anymore because the second generation decided that they actually want to be in a proper capitalistic society. They want to have their own car, they want to get whatever they work for, they don't want to share. So I just wanted to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the failure of the kibbutz is that the failure of the anarchist on a larger scale. I just think that if the problem is the fact that there is no control over the market, and the market is a global force, so commercial society is global and it's globally expanding, then it's really hard to see that how it's actually going to work, how an alternative system is going to work on this small scale, whether it's the cafe scale or the small country scale. Now, again, I'm not saying, because I haven't given the view on what happens once you have this critique of capitalism. What is the right social system that we could construct if we try to move away from capitalism? All I'm saying is that in capitalism, freedom is undermined. Now, whether in a kibbutz or in a world that is run like a kibbutz, it would work differently, I haven't made that claim yet. I think it would, because if you structure global institutions and state institutions in such a way that a different incentive system is in place, that you have different organization of labor, that you remove the profit motive or you contain it based on social control, then you probably wouldn't see all these pathologies of commodified society that we were just describing. But I think the fact that people say it's, of course, we had half of the world that was socialist at one point. Why did it fail? Because people wanted bananas and jeans. So I don't think it's not a mystery in a way that when you have world order that is ruled by certain incentives. It's really hard, and the work that you have to do is one where it's social psychology as much as changing the rules of legal compliance.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. As a non-theorist, I was rather reluctant to put my hand up, but your reply to the last question really did strike me home, because I mean, one of the ways of responding to what you're saying, at the end of the day, you may just be describing the human condition, i.e. that freedom of action may not be possible, because the truth is that human beings are always constrained by a social structure, which you talked about. But what I think was also interesting about your critique is you're also saying that capitalism also helps to generate a set of social norms. But it's because of that element of your talk that led me to want to ask the question, because central to what you seem to be arguing is that somewhere out there is what the person wants to do if they have the freedom of action to do it. But if at the end of the day, our ideas and our values are indeed partly the product of social interaction and social norms, where does this come from? Is there action? Can we actually talk about some sense of what people would want to do, which is right and proper, which is actually independent of the circumstances in which they live?
Yeah, great, thank you. It's a really good question. And I think it's one that is going to reveal probably a fundamental divide in how we think about moral philosophy. So I think some people would say, if they are, Nietzscheans or some I don't know, sophists, or there's a whole tradition in philosophy that would say that all there is to justice is power, which is another way of formulating some of the things that you've been saying. So we just internalize our values and we call them values, but actually that's just what the powerful are doing. And so social norms are always determined by one way of thinking about power relations and what Nietzsche called slave morality and so on. There's another tradition in philosophy, and that's why the first line of my paper was to say, one tradition in philosophy thinks that there is a distinction between freedom of choice and freedom of agency. In other words, that this is not all just rhetoric and something that we've just absorbed or just a way of talking. There is rationally a way in which we can understand the difference between what we feel we want to do and what we ought to do. That there is a sense in which there's a kind of real moral constraint there, and that moral norm isn't just a myth, isn't just having been persuaded, having been socialized, that we as species have this insight into what is the right thing to do. Of course, if you don't think that follows, then none of what I said, then capitalism is fine. So I think, in a way, this is just me putting my kind of moral philosophy out there and saying, this is where I come from philosophically. And if that way of understanding morality makes sense and human nature makes sense, and people seem to think that, some people seem to think it makes sense, it has made sense historically to a lot of people. You wouldn't understand why there is at some point slave rebellions. Why do people liberate themselves? Why do we have these examples in history where it's not in someone's self-interest to go and get themselves killed in the name of a principle, and yet they do it? And I think that other way of thinking about morality struggles with those counterexamples. And that's why I don't belong to that. I don't subscribe to that school of thought. But yeah, I think it's a fair question.
Yeah, because human beings find themselves in a situation where they have to act differently from what they would like to do is not uncommon, but that doesn't necessarily require there to be some moral imperative behind what they should do, what they think they would like to do.
Well, I think if you ask yourself what is the difference between what we ought to do and what we do, you'll find that there is a moral imperative. But that's a long conversation. The only Yeah, but then we have to unpack what does it mean. And I think maybe can I just say one last word on human nature, because I feel that's also very important, actually, this difference between people who tend to broadly be sympathetic to what I'm saying and those who really resist that. And it really is some insight, intuition about human nature. And I think the right answer when we think about human nature isn't to say, human nature is either good or bad. So the pessimist, the person would resist this argument about capitalism is not the end. We can think about the end of capitalism. We can think of a better social structure. Would say, but what about human nature? Humans are greedy. And I think human nature is both. And there isn't an argument that settles it one way or another. And since it's both, and since a lot of art and literature and religion and products of the human spirit tell us that we can also be this other thing other than greedy and selfish and interest maximizing, then why should we always take the negative view as the mainstream one? And why should we not actually give a hearing to the other one as well?
I think we have time for one more question,
Sorry.
folks. Does anybody have? Wonderful. Could you bring the microphone over to Maud here, please?
Thank you very much, Professor Ipi, for such a fascinating talk. Just a quick question, which follows on partly from the previous question and partly from your answer to the previous question. And it's a historian's question. I'm a historian. So like I was constantly, as you were talking, I was thinking about historical change and what engenders historical change and what is the theory of historical and social change in what you outlined. So if I were to ask you what is your theory of historical change in what you outlined, that's a hugely broad question, but maybe it allows you to answer it the way you want to answer it. So that's kind of the broader question. But a more specific question is about resistance and rebellions, which you just mentioned earlier, and which you also pointed out or hinted at in the final sentence of your talk. You hinted at the possibility of resistance and rebellion and kind of relatively lined up. And again, I'm thinking about history, and really just generally, I'm thinking about under what. Well, partly I'm thinking about the previous comment, which is the freedom of agency in the kind of way in which you understand it, in a kind of authentic way, is that even possible? Under what kind of system is that even possible? Because we're always inscribed in social relationships. But when we look at history, how do you see that unfolding in history? Like what kind of historical and social conditions would engender that? Or would make it possible for people to act in that kind of way?
Well, I mean, so I guess the claim I'm making here, which is not about all of human history, but it's about the history of the world now and the time and place that we're in now, I would say that the change that we need is a change that fights capitalism. So, but I think for that, the examples in history aren't past examples. This is where I think I'm also really interested in history, and one of the reasons I'm really interested is that I'm always thinking also about conjectural history. So not just history of the past, but also history of hypothetical counterfactuals, things that didn't happen, things that could have happened, openings in particular points in time and I think those are really important, especially when you're thinking about resistance. Is this conjectural history, this alternative paths not taken, that history is really important, but not in the way of describing details and facts and characters, more in the way of trying to understand these openings that were not taken or were not followed through. And I guess this links to the first question, which is, for me, what drives historical change is freedom, is this idea that we have this sort of moral capacity within us. But the capacity is one thing. The ability to realize what that capacity that is in you requires of you is not the same thing. That depends on institutions and on society and politics. So this goes back to this distinction I started with, which is the freedom to think what is right and the freedom to do what is right. I think we all have this freedom to think what is right, and that's often what drives historical change, is this gap between how I want the world to be and how it actually is, and this is what moves me. And then, of course, there's more sophisticated Marxist or Hegelian stories about how that happens and, how classes are formed or social groups are formed based on that. But for me, that's the sort of insight. Of course, if you have the alternative view, you would say, what is it that drives historical change? It's just power grab. The power need to get more power and the weak need to just be fighting that power. And so that's another way of thinking about what drives historical change. But my preferred view is this one that is the sort of Hegelian or even Kantian Hegelian Marxist one, which is about freedom.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I hope that you've enjoyed this evening as much as I have. If you have, and you're new to the work of the Stevenson Trust, please do go along to the Trust's website. You can sign up for a mailing list on there, I think. And there's a treasure trove of resources there, including past Knowles lectures and shortly this one. But in the meanwhile, it remains just for us to thank our wonderful Professor Ipi. And this is the next Stevenson lecture, which is taking place next week on Tuesday. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. Thanks.
That was wonderfully well judged.
Really nice. I enjoyed it.
Great talk. I really enjoyed it. I always learn so much of these things.
It took me quite a while to get used to it. So what we done last time so I think because it's on like we're doing that. So that's it now the way. It's really good.
I'll get it. Oh, did you get Nicholas?
Got two. Yeah, no, did I? Is this? Did you put it down? Okay, that's.
Human rights. You keep an eye on that.
I've got two.
I'm going to so
Got to you go what?
I'm going to see.
Okay.